I have a theory that for the same money you can get better finishing on a watch and perhaps a better package from Germany than you can from Switzerland. The Swiss are overpriced. Like you hear it in the comments of every video that mentions Rolex, Patek, or AP. And I won't dispute that luxury watches aren't the exact equivalent of the price compared to the sum of their parts. Rarity, availability, and certainly hype influence the value and increase the price. We'll be looking mainly at two different watches to look at this dispute, and that is the H. Moser Pioneer Center Seconds and the Glassute Original SeaQ chronograph. Near the end, I have a dark horse option from America and another sneak peek of a watch I'll be reviewing next week, so subscribe if you want to see that. Before jumping in the models, let's understand watch finishing. So here's your index. So first you have anglage, which is French for angling. It means beveling or chamfering. It describes a movement finishing technique in which right angle edges of the bridges, plates, or other components are filed or polished at a 45-degree angle. Outward points, and more importantly, inward points, are the hardest to complete. Machines can't do the work on inward points, which is why for most of that it has to be done by hand. These inward angles at a sharp point are going to be your notice that it was done by hand. More rounded corners are seen typically on machine finished watches because they're easier to accomplish. Bluing, which can be chemical or heat blued. Chemical blued on less expensive alternatives. Heat blued is done usually in a furnace rather than holding a hand actually over an open flame. This adds contrast and was developed to keep steel from rusting or corroding. Heat purpling and browning are also techniques that are seen in watches. Brushing, which is any lateral swiped edges. It's sometimes called satin brushing or satin finished. It can include anything that looks like it was done by a bristle brush. Engraving, which is carving out of metal to make a pattern. There's also chasing, which is a form of engraving where the engraver actually carves the negative space to show a raised surface that makes the pattern. There's frosting, which is usually media blasted on less expensive alternatives. There's also tremblage, which is when it's done by hand, either with a burin or a hammer and chisel. There's guilloche, which is any circular type pattern carved into a surface, usually by hand, sometimes stamped. The less expensive is done as a stamped process, but you can see the difference under macro. This includes a lot of patterns, including clous de Paris, which is nails of Paris or aka hobnail, barleycorn, waves, and many other techniques, including the Royal Oak tapestry dial. There's perlage, which is circular graining. Traditionally, this was done by a wood rod and wet sanding paste, but now almost all perlage is done by machine unless it's very easily noted by the manufacturer it was done by hand. There's polishing, which is broad because it can be almost any sort of polishing. Any sort of reflective surface is some sort of polish. The hardest is black polishing, which is so flat and so blemish free that it looks almost black in certain lighting, and in other lighting, when you turn it off axis, you can see a really bright reflection. Zaratsu, done by a Salaz lapping machine, is the industrialized equivalent of black polishing for cases, which is seen in Grand Seiko. Sinks, which are counterbore settings, where they're also black polished for each of the screws to line up in their slot. There's chatons. You'll see this in old or traditional watches these days, high-end watches, where they'll actually route out part of the bridge and then they'll drop in a golden sink for each of the jewels to actually set in. Slotting, which the complexity at which the slot and shape of a screw perfectly formed and flat and having the correct type of slot. Given the size and detail of this sort of slotting in a screw, the perfect slotting results in what's known as the $100 screw, which is usually only seen on really, really high-end watches. Most screws are industrially produced. Open working, which can be done by machine or is done by hand. This is where the bridges and parts are carved out to show more of the watch. That isn't to be confused with skeletonization, where the bridges were actually already made with more of an open concept to see through the watch. And lastly, we have striping. Now, this is typically known as Côte de Genève or Geneva striping. This can appear in entry-level calibers all the way up to really high-end watches. These are either created with a wooden cutting tool that creates this textured finish, or with a lathe if it's done by hand. The industrial version is that it's done with a CNC machine. Now, there's this idea where this is done basically to catch the dust particles in a watch, but many watchmakers say it's purely decorative and not to be deceived. Glassute striping or ribbing is seen as different than Geneva striping because some German watchmakers claim that these are distinctive from their Swiss variant, but that's up to you to decide. So who does it best for the same money? Each of these watches is around the same price at $15,000. Each of these is a larger watch around 43 millimeters. Admittedly, the Glassute is more complicated with a chronograph and a big date, while the H. Moser is a time-only watch, but we're gonna focus mainly on finishing today. And you can see wrist shots with each of these watches. They both wear very well. The SeaQ chronograph is coming in pretty tall at 17 millimeters thick, so you'll have to decide if that's worth it for you. The tapered lugs do help, but the Moser has these arched lugs and it stays very tight to the wrist. So I think the 43 millimeters wears still like a 43 given the dial size, but it wears still comfortably. But today we're talking again mainly movement finishing. If you want to see separate reviews on those, let me know down below. So if we look at the finishing of the H. Moser first, you see what you see with the Moser is really well executed simplicity. You're going to notice that these angles are really well polished. You're going to notice there are a few actual outward points, although there are no inward points present on here. Mainly Geneva striping or Côte de Genève. You're going to see black polished screws. You're going to see a lot of this anglage work speaking for itself more than anything. A lot of this angling, especially around each of the bridges, including the balance wheel bridge, and looking at each of these bridges where they come next to one another. And it plays with the light really well. It's simple, but it speaks a lot in the fact that you notice the basic construction being really uniform. And I think that it's beautiful in that way. They've got sinks here for these different jewels, along with these outward points, along with some of the frosting you find here on the rotor. It just overall is very cohesive, very well done, simple, sure, but incredibly well executed. Now, the Glassute, on the other hand, definitely has a lot going on. The extra layer that you get with the fact that it's chronograph movement is that you get a lot more information. You notice a lot more things. They didn't worry as much about color consistency, and so you can see there's more gold accents, there's blued screws, so there's definitely more color and more depth here. And so it's a little bit more overwhelming, I would say, in its overall presentation. And I think that can be a good thing or a bad thing stylistically. Each of these elements is well done. While the anglage isn't quite as deep or as noticeable, it's still there. You can notice a lot of polishing. I mean, they've black polished the column wheel itself. Each of the tops of these screws, which ones aren't heat blued, are then polished. They've got all the anglage on all the bridges. You've got this nice little detail here of this rotor with this striping on it, or Glassute stripes on it. You can see all the engraving work too, where it calls out that it's adjusted the name of the company. Now, while you don't get sinks like you do on the H. Moser, you are finding obviously more components that have to be touched, including frosting here on the lower bridges. Quick thank you to Exquisite Timepieces in Naples, Florida for letting me borrow both these watches for this video. If you want to find their information, I have it in the description down below for the salesperson I work with. Now, what about the cases or bracelets? See, finishing doesn't stop at the movement. The Moser Pioneer here doesn't have a bracelet, so we'll focus mainly on case finishing. That being said, there are a few things I really like in this SeaQ, like the adjustable clasp. But there's a pretty big difference on the case finishing between these two. See, the Glassute is obviously machined case with a light chamfer on the edges here, while the Pioneer, by contrast, has satin finished tops and polished sides of the case. But there's complexity beyond that, where the lug has angles in 2 dimensions before it even reaches the side of the lug. And then inside the side of the lug and the case side there, you can see there's a cut or recess that actually follows at an angle to match the recess that would happen with the case. And then there's grooves finished as well inside that cavity. And then everything's polished cleanly so that it looks perfect, basically, as it recesses in. And while this is also a stylistic question, this sort of cavity and case finishing, I think, is a tactile and visual reminder of the finishing that's hiding in the back of the watch, which I think overall gives you the interpretation that it is likely nicer than the Glassute from a finishing level, purely because the case finishing is the first thing that you notice. Now, if you do like movement finishing and you don't want to spend a fortune, this is an American railroad grade pocket watch by Hamilton that was made in the 40s. I bought this on eBay for 250 bucks. Look at the striping. Look at the beveling on the sides of these bridges, the blued screws, the golden chatons here. If you want to see high-end finishing or even add it to your collection, you don't have to spend $15,000. There's no better way to go than a pocket watch, particularly a railroad grade pocket watch from the early 20th century if you're looking for value for money. But you can also find examples including perpetual calendars and all sorts of other stuff within pocket watches for way less. So who does it better between Germany, Switzerland, or even the pocket watch? I think this part is a little bit more personal than it is about the finishing, both brand influence as well as overall aesthetics and which speaks to you more. See, one is simpler, but perfectly executed. It has deeper chamfers, while the SeaQ sheer quantity of bridges and parts that needed to be beveled and polished could speak to you as well. You see, the complexity of different types of finishing within the SeaQ and the depth that comes with that could speak to you more than the simple perfect execution you see on the Pioneer. Now, when it comes to case finishing, I think the Moser Pioneer here certainly stands out as incredibly well finished and better than the finishing you'll find on the Glassute. But it's a matter of where you can spend your money. Most of that extra money that you might have seen in the case probably went into the complexity of the movement and the complications that you have. But what do you guys think? See, I'll be covering another part of finishing here with the Patek Philippe 5930G soon on the channel, so if you want to see that, subscribe. I hope this was helpful and educational. Until the next one, peace.